So this is when we move from the spectator sport into the contact sport of the morning. So first I want to start by thanking GAMA for the break that we just had, and again to thank all of our sponsors for helping make this possible. We are now going to have an interesting discussion about the comprehensive FAA bill, otherwise known as FAA reform. I think most of you know there's been a pretty robust dialogue going on this topic in Washington and in the country over the last few months. And we're very lucky that we got Will Ris, not only to come out of retirement, but to put a suit on today and join us to be able to moderate this panel. Will, as many of you know, retired recently as a senior vice president. I think you're now the senior vice president of retirement. You were an executive, I think, at American, where he was for 20 years. Before that, he was counsel to the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, where he worked on Airline Deregulation Act. He was also the winner of the 2015 Donald Edgin Trophy. And we're really thrilled to have a person who also missed his calling as a stand-up comedian to be here to moderate the next panel, because I think some of that might come in handy. So thank you and welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, everybody. This is going to be, we don't have a lot of time. We have an incredible panel ahead of us. I do want to apologize in advance. Being in retirement, this time of day, I'm usually still in my pajamas yelling at the television set. So I apologize to you. But I want to make one thing clear. This is my panel. I'm in charge here. I can dismiss any panel member at any time for any reason or for no reason at all.
Can we go now?
No. And I just will tell the panel members, if I don't like what you're saying and I pull you to the side and I say, I hope you will stop speaking, that means I order you to stop speaking, okay? We got that clear? All right, excellent, thank you. As I said, we have a phenomenal panel. These people are really the experts in this arena. They are the leaders of both the forces for reform and against. They are the principal spokespeople. They will be very polite and diplomatic, but let me assure you they all hate each other. Anyway, their bios are in the program, but very briefly, sitting next to me, Ed Bolin, who is the president and CEO of the National Business Aviation Association, and a highly respected and very articulate spokesperson in the general aviation field. Next to him, Jim Burnley, who so many years ago, I think it was I can't remember the Hoover administration, but was Secretary of Transportation, but is now with the venerable law firm representing everybody he can represent. His business cards are in the back. And an articulate spokesman for reform. Next to him, Nick Callio, who is the president and CEO of Airlines for America, which is the trade association that represents most of the major commercial airlines. And next to him, Jim Kuhn, who has probably held every job in Washington known to mankind, but is the senior vice president for government affairs for AOPA, and another incredibly articulate spokesperson for general aviation. Next to him, Gerald Dillingham, who has been the chief civil aviation issues person at the Government Accountability Office since Wilbur and Orville were around. But Gerald has just been here forever. And then Paul Rinaldi, for those of you who listen to the Washington Nationals baseball games late in the games, you'll hear Paul on his advertising for NATCA. He is the president of the National Air Traffic Controllers Union, and he is an amazing individual. And all these guys are phenomenal. So I want to jump right into the issue, because the issue, this is actually a phenomenal experience, because a lot of things have happened just in the last couple of weeks. And you've got these incredible experts to talk about it. And what I'd like to do is just sort of go down the line and ask each of them to try to limit their remarks to to, really 2 minutes. Just give us the highlight, and then we'll get into some more substance. And the question I'd like to ask each of you, from your perspective and who you represent, is it time for a fundamental structural change in the way that the air traffic services are provided? Or is it a time for moderate, thoughtful reform, or is it a time to do nothing at all? And I'd just start here with Ed, and we'll go down the line, and tell us what your thoughts are.
Well, I think for a number of years, NBAA and a number of the general aviation associations have been very focused on trying to make sure that the U.S. remains the world leader in all aspects of aviation. And we have been an early and strong advocate of NextGen. The idea behind it is that if we can have NextGen create additional capacity, then general aviation, like others in the aviation community, will be able to fly affordably, predictably, safely, and there will be enough capacity to allow that to happen. Safety will increase and our environmental footprint will decrease. And so we've been very focused on how to make NextGen a reality. And I think for the last several years, the NextGen Advisory Committee has been working to make NextGen happen. We're a little frustrated with the progress in some areas, very pleased with it in others. But we do think the whole focus on NextGen has helped identify specific challenges that we can address with very targeted solutions. And so we have been promoting those solutions over the past couple of years. We want to do it in a way that ensures that the public airspace, which belongs to the public, serves all of the public interest. So we are very much for accelerating the pace of modernization and making sure that the U.S. has not just the best aviation system today, but 5, 10, and 15 years from now.
Okay, Jim?
Many of you in this room have intimate familiarity with these paper strips. If the current FAA procurement to replace them stays on time, and often that is not how, as we know, such procurements play out, in 2028, these strips will disappear from the 89 most congested air traffic control facilities. And if one of Paul's members has the misfortune to be in facility number 90 or 91 or 92, there's no end in sight to this. There's no end in sight to this. The excellent aviation reporter of 25, 30 years standing, the Wall Street Journal, Scott McCartney, spent a couple of days last summer at NAV Canada and wrote an incredible piece that I recommend to you and pointed out something I hadn't realized, and that is when a plane is crossing the U.S.-Canadian border in the air traffic control system, the handoff from the Canadian controller to the U.S. controller or the other way around is done by telephone. That's because our system can't do it electronically. Canadians for years have had that capacity. Jeff Shane, who is the current general counsel of IATA, gave a speech about 18 months ago. And for those of you who don't know Jeff's background, he started as a junior lawyer at DOT in the 70s and has held virtually every senior position that involves aviation policy, including Undersecretary of Transportation in the last Bush administration. And Jeff posed the question this way. If today you were designing a structure within which you would house this unbelievably complex 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week business, is this the structure you would come up with? And I think that is exactly the right question. There is no conceivable excuse to stay on a path that has the airlines today adding 20 to 30 minutes to their scheduled block times between LaGuardia and DCA or between Dallas and Philadelphia. I don't think anybody can make that case with a straight face anymore. So we are at a point where either we can continue to use paper strips for at least another decade and beyond in smaller facilities, or we can look at alternatives like NAV Canada, that have a demonstrated track record of serving all users, not just airlines, but all users, with more efficiency and bringing new technology years and unfortunately decades into the system sooner than we are capable of doing.
Thank you. Nick?
Well, Will, in answer to your question, is now the time? The time actually was 20 plus years ago when President Clinton proposed doing what's being proposed now. And the reason that he proposed it then, because not enough progress was being made on NextGen. And we can tout the advancements of NextGen, and there are some. And there's certainly, thanks to RTCA and the NextGen Advisory Committee, is more focus in a way that could be meaningful. However, you tout SeaTac all the time up in Seattle. If you talk to Brad Tilden from Alaska, they're using the NextGen approaches in less than 1% of the flights. If you talk to United and Southwest about what's gone on in Houston with the creation of the NextGen procedures there, it's taking longer. The flights are now longer. And I think Jim hit on it very well. What we are doing, we have frozen ourselves in place because of special interest opposition to any kind of change whatsoever, regardless of whatever kind of deal is cut for them. And what we're getting is people taking longer to fly from point A to point B. It's very frustrating. It wastes fuel, it wastes energy, it's a waste of business time, it's a waste of leisure time, and it costs a lot more. We can make progress if we open our minds. We can put protections in for the people who want protections. But we need to make the change now. We have to quit talking about this. It's pretty ridiculous at this point. Talking about being a leader, we're way behind already. And we're going to continue to fall further behind if we keep in place a process that you cannot monitor. If you talk to the congressional appropriators, and I'm going to say this right out loud, they talk about protecting the taxpayer. And it's not, well, they have not protected the taxpayer. They bring in people from the Inspector General's office, GAO, and others, and then do nothing about the reports they get on cost overruns and delays, all of which is inexcusable. We can operate a better system. We have the best air traffic controllers. We can do a lot better than we're doing right now.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, first let me thank RTCA for this panel today. It's a privilege to be up here with the leaders of aviation. I'm here representing AOPA. My boss, Mark Baker, fortunately had a meeting outside of town, so again, thank you for this opportunity. So, been around this debate for a long time, probably 30, 40 years, and it's almost kind of deja vu. I think in order to obtain any kind of transformational change, you have to have consensus. And I'm not sure that there's consensus today, or there was consensus 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And for various reasons, depending upon what seat you view this transformational change from. I've had the privilege, as our illustrious moderator alluded to, of having spent 25 years on Capitol Hill, and I've seen how the mindset works there. I've been with the airlines, I've been with Boeing, and so taking those types of, that knowledge back to Capitol Hill and trying to make policy has always been something that I've always enjoyed. And so from the aviation perspective, or general aviation perspective, you know, we really don't hear from our membership, our nearly 350,000 members really don't complain about our air traffic control system. We have a very good system in place today. What we hear about are costs and bureaucracy. And we've always said that there can be some reforms made to improve the system and make it more efficient and effective. So you really have to look at this thing holistically. You have to look at it and understand where everybody's coming from on this debate. You have to think down the road as to whether or not increasing efficiencies and capacity in the system. We certainly want more people to fly. They've got to have a place to land. We can't build new airports in this country, so we have to address those kinds of things. We have to really define what is the problem. What is the problem? If we privatize, will it eliminate the 70% of delays in the commercial system coming out of New York airspace? Those kinds of things have to be addressed, no doubt. And so from that perspective, we do believe that there's some reforms can be made, and that's where we are on reform.
Okay, thank you. Next, Gerald, and just so folks in the room know, Gerald tries his best to be Switzerland in this debate, and so if he pulls his punches, that's he is with the Government Accountability Office and reports to both sides of the aisle, both sides of the hill. So, Gerald.
Thanks, Will. I want to pick up where Jim left off. From our perspective, the first question we ask is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? We've looked across air traffic control organizations across the country, from Europe to Australia to Canada, and there are really no inherent differences in sort of the outcomes of those systems. But it's very important to understand what is the problem we're trying to solve, and to what extent the kind of reforms that are being discussed now will actually solve those problems. And there are a lot of different ways and varieties in which to approach that. And it's not clear exactly what we're trying to achieve. If it's stability of funding, that can be achieved in one way. If it is sort of increased speed with modernization, that's yet still another issue. So again, it's very important to get to the base and understand where we're going and learn some lessons from what's happened across the world over these last 30 to 40 years of change.
Paul, I think Gerald just delivered a softball to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. The problem is clear: stable, predictable, reliable funding. We're high-fiving each other because we have a 5-month spending bill right now, which at the end of September is probably going to be pretty ugly. We have some calling for shutdowns to get the budget under control, approaching $20 trillion in debt. And aviation takes a back seat to a lot of other important issues in Congress. And we have a concern. Last year I was on this panel, and someone said, will we have a comprehensive FAA reauthorization bill? And I said, no. And then I said, just Congress can't get their act together. And someone from the audience yelled at me that, you can't blame Congress for this. I go, I can, because they're so parochial. And right now, whether it is Syrian refugees, immigration, gun control, which will be a big issue now, that's going to come up after the tragedy that happened this morning, all of these things are very important issues, but should not hold our aviation system in control that it can't grow and modernize. Now, the problem is clear to us. We've seen many short-term extensions. We've seen sequester. We're going to look at a very tight 2018 budget, if there is a budget. And we're going to look at shrinking aviation in this country, and that's a massive concern of ours. Status quo is unacceptable. It is time for a change. A for-profit model is unacceptable. Somewhere in between there, we have to find a way so that we can modernize quickly, because, as Secretary Burnley said, 2028, on a concept that started a conversation within the FAA requirements procurement process in 2014. So if it stays on track, it's 15 years, 18 years down the road that the top 90 facilities may get it. But I promise you, as every other project that we have within the FAA, it will fall short of money, and it will start cutting back the waterfall until they go, okay, we have this in the top 10 facilities, and then we'll just have another one-off program that has to be maintained while we look for the next best shiny thing to go forward. And the technology is going to be 15 years old. We have to do it better. You look at our partners to the north in Canada, and they could go from concept to requirements to development to training to implementation in roughly 36 months. That's real-time technology. And if you look at the evolving communities that are emerging communities that want to come into our airspace with UASs and commercial spacing, want more chunks and more launches into our airspace, and you look how quick technology is evolving and how everybody's looking at that iPhone 8 right now, we have to be quicker, more nimble, more dynamic in modernizing our system. Currently today, we run the safest, most efficient system in the world. but I can't say what it's going to look like 5 years from now. We are at a 28-year low of our controller staffing, which is a complete struggle. We're seeing delays, miles in trail putting in on the airlines out of New York and out of our other short-staffed facilities, TRACONs in the country, and we seem to be stuck in the mud. We're hiring, but we can't get people on board into these bigger facilities because we're just locked in. It's going to take 3 to 5 years. That's if we continue to hire. Now, if 2018 budget is the way it looks like it's going to be, they're going to look at shutting the academy down one more time. And that's a huge concern of ours. All of these things will impact aviation and will shrink aviation in this country. And all of us make our living on aviation in this country. That's why you're in this room. And you should all be seriously concerned if we start shrinking it. I might not even, in 2028, might not even have 90 towers that we're representing. We might have a core 30 because that's all the budget allows us to have.
Okay, on that point, let me just quote the president. The president in the news conference said that quote, the effort to modernize air traffic control technology has simply not been able to keep pace with either the emergence of new technology or the growth in demand for air travel. And while we made significant progress as the horrendous, I don't know how else to say it, just the horrendous flight delay statistics demonstrate, we've done not nearly enough. Widespread passenger frustration and anger, which I hear about wherever I go. These delays are costing airlines and passengers more and more. Part of the problem is due to outdated technology, but a more fundamental part of the problem is how the FAA operates. Agree or disagree? And by the way, that was Bill Clinton 17 years ago. That was not Donald Trump. Any comments on that?
He's still right.
I mean,
that's a tragedy. It was 17 years ago.
I would like to address the myth around delays. I think, yes, our staffing is starting to impact and starting to see some delays, especially at a New York TRACON. But the majority of the delays you see in the system is weather-based. Nobody, and nor should they want to, go through these lines of thunderstorms that you see, and or if it's a snow event, obviously you're not putting as many airplanes on the runway, and then you have a de-icing event, which takes extra time. Weather is unfortunately, and we're not going to be able to control that, obviously, is the largest cause of our delays in our system.
Anybody else?
Well, I think the airlines, according to the DOT, have a large part to play in that as well. I think the airlines have, according to DOT statistics, something like 60% of the travel delays. I agree with Paul. I think it's really important that we understand what role weather plays and what some of the limits are. As enthusiastic as we are about NextGen, as committed as we are to make it a reality, I think some of the things that have been said about airports not being built, weather being a problem, are important to focus on. I think there's some broad statements that, there are some easy solutions out there that are going to provide unlimited capacity. I think as we've all looked at it, that NextGen could provide maybe 10 or 15% more capacity, and that's really important, and we focus on it. But it was brought up that runways are important too. And until we solve some of those issues, I think we ought to be a little limited in what we promise, because I think that has been a problem in the past.
Okay, Nick, it's your fault?
No, I don't think so, and I think the stats are debatable because 50% are due to air traffic control congestion, according to the DOT, and not 60% for us. Put that aside, though. What we're talking about here is continuing to do the same thing over and over again that hasn't worked. And it's the governance and funding structure at the FAA, that has many good employees, that is the cause of all this. We can't just keep moving along at a snail's pace. And I don't think anybody's suggesting that there are simple solutions here. There would have to be a transition. We have to learn to operate better, but we can certainly do it on a better basis than what we're doing now, where we are bundled up in a bureaucracy that is required to move slowly, to change its mind, and can't see a project or many projects done from the beginning to the end. When you're talking about average delays of 14 to 54 months, I mean, come on. So we're going to just keep doing that until the next time it comes. The time for change is actually now. I think all aviation stakeholders will be accommodated in a good way, and we'll all have a better system. And we're not going to have people sitting on the tarmacs or cargo sitting on the tarmacs longer than it should be.
Okay, let's go to the latest proposal on the table. 2 weeks ago, I quoted President Clinton from 17 years ago, but 2 weeks ago there was a press conference in the White House, and President Trump, Vice President Pence, Secretary Chow, and a number of other people were there. It was a high visibility press conference, and the president strongly endorsed a proposal to spin the air traffic control organization out of the FAA into a not-for-profit organization that would be self-funded. And I want to read to you something that he said that wasn't, I don't think, in the script. I want to ask each of you or any of you if you agree or disagree with it. And then I want you to address whether you think that particular event advanced or delayed the possibility of reform. This is what the president said, and I'm quoting him directly. The current system cannot keep up, hasn't been able to keep up for many years. It causes flight delays and crippling inefficiencies. And then he goes on to say the FAA has been trying to upgrade our nation's air traffic control system for a long period of years, but after billions and billions of tax dollars spent and many years of delays, we are still stuck with an ancient, broken, antiquated, horrible system that doesn't work. Other than that, it's quite good. Laughter. And then this sentence, which I don't think was in the prepared remarks, he said the previous administration spent over $7 billion trying to upgrade the system and totally failed. Honestly, they didn't know what the hell they were doing. A total waste of money, $7 billion plus plus. Agree or disagree?
I
Gerald?
disagree.
Yeah.
So do I.
But
So do I.
the underlying point that, I mean, he was speaking in Trumpese, and we all, whether we're used to it or not, we're all familiar with it by now. And I can tell you, I was reading the teleprompter standing behind him, and that was not in the prepared remarks. It'd be no shock to hear. So I know that
Shocker.
I know that was a Trumpism.
Well, you were whispering in his ear. Was that the deal?
I don't think the Secret Service would have liked that. But the underlying point, the thrust of the argument has some validity. The FAA did not get transferred to the Clinton administration's version of reform, which was a government corporation called the U.S. Air Traffic Service Corporation, you may recall. And I think, by the way, the tweaks between a private nonprofit and a so-called government corporation, if the latter is truly emancipated from the executive branch of the government, are fairly marginal. But the caveat matters about being emancipated. But the fact is that in the mid-90s, the Clinton administration did convince Congress to pass personnel and procurement reforms. Many of you in this room remember that, may have been affected by it, may have been at the FAA at the time. And if you talk to any FAA administrator or any ATO leader since then, they're unanimous. It didn't work. It did not work. And as Nick said a few moments ago, you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different outcomes. You know, I'm trying to be polite here. There's a word for that, and I'm not going to say it. So we really do have to face up to this issue at some point. And if we don't face up to it now, we're all, as travelers, going to suffer, whether you're flying in a general aviation aircraft or you're on a commercial plane, because the system will always be safe. Everybody in the room, I think, agrees to that. But Paul, the way you keep it safe is by ever slowing it down, isn't it? If you don't have the technology and the personnel to gain the efficiency.
We don't use the word slow down. We use the reducing capacity.
Reducing capacity. I want to get back to the safety issue in a second, but Gerald, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I mean, my organization is not in the habit of defending FAA, but a lot of the work that we've done doesn't necessarily support the idea that nothing has been done and $7 billion has been wasted. In fact, as everyone on the panel has said, we have the safest, not only the largest, but the safest, most complicated air traffic system on the planet, and tens of thousands of planes go and come every day. And we're in an era of the safest era of aviation ever. So I think when we talk about all the things that Paul said and everybody said about weather and control of staffing and all of those kinds of things are contributing to the delays and some of the issues that are taking place. It's also true that there's no guarantee, and we haven't been able to find any way that going to, let's just say a NAV Canada, for example, is going to answer those issues. So I think again, we're back to not thinking that that's a panacea for sort of throwing the baby out with the water kind of thing. So again, just to, sort of keep a little balance on what's happening and the idea that this is a very complex undertaking that the U.S. is doing right now, and it takes time to lay that framework, that groundwork, and no one is really satisfied with the pace, especially the first 5 to 10 years of what has happened with the modernization. But what we found is that there is progress being made. There are changes in the system. When we had that 1 in every 4 aircraft were late or delayed in some fashion, that statistic has been modified as well. So there's some pluses associated with where we are now, and we need to be careful about where we are taking ourselves to.
I want to call on Ed Bolin here for a second, but I want one quick follow-up to you, Gerald. Yesterday, Congressman Peter DeFazio, who's the ranking Democrat on the House Transportation Committee, issued a Dear Colleague letter. And on the top of it, it was based on a briefing that you had given the Democrats on the committee. And the headline says, and this is DeFazio's words, "Government watchdog refutes arguments for air traffic control privatization." Is that how you would characterize your report?
No, I would not characterize our report as refuting Mr. DeFazio. I can't say Mr. DeFazio is wrong. I'm saying we've not said that. We've not taken a position. Our position has always been, think about what you're trying to solve and then how we want to go about solving it. So we have not taken a position one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. Ed?
Yeah, that characterization, I think it's important to try to figure out where are we now. And I think what we have heard is, we heard from Paul Rinaldi, we've got the largest, the safest, most efficient air transportation system in the world. Gerald has said we're making progress on that. So I think, there may have been the comment that it's broken seems at odds with what we heard from the Inspector General, who, when he testified before the House of Representatives, was specifically asked that question, and he said it's not broken. So, I think understanding a baseline is positive, but I think it gets to a bigger question because we're using a lot of words interchangeably here. Sometimes we say modernization, sometimes we say reform, sometimes we say, commercialization, privatization, whatever that is. I think Gerald made a very good point earlier. Trying to figure out what is the issue we're trying to solve and then what are the options for solving it is a worthwhile approach. I've talked about the need to make NextGen a reality. Paul's talked appropriately about the need for stable, predictable funding streams. I think there are ways that we can get together and solve some of those problems. But if the problems keep getting conflated and the same issues get thrown out, part of the reason we've had so many extensions, so many delays passing FAA reauthorization is because this issue of taking the ATC out of government keeps being put on the table. It keeps being debated. It keeps being talked about. In the end, I think a lot of people have said there's a better way forward. And so, I think that's got to be part of the question here is what words are we using, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and what are the different alternatives that are being discussed. I don't think it's a one or the other. We're going to stay in place because as has been indicated, we've got a safe system, we've got an efficient system, we're making progress, and I think that's very important. And I think we need to recognize that a lot of work is being done.
Okay.
If I could just add, I just want to be sure the historical record is not distorted. The last go-round to get a multi-year FAA reauthorization bill included 23 short-term extensions, and nobody was pushing reform of the air traffic control system. So perhaps inadvertently you suggested that those two were tied. There's no relationship because the issue was dormant. And that is a perfect example of why we cannot get where we all ultimately want to go, which is an air traffic control system that has world-leading state-of-the-art technology and is the most efficient in the world in the 2028 period and beyond. But I want to be very clear about the historical record. 23 short-term extensions, sometimes days or a couple of weeks. It had nothing to do with this issue. It had to do with the inability of the US Congress and the administration to come together on a multi-year bill, full stop.
Okay. Okay, so let me tee off this in terms of setting, the question that Ed and Gerald and others have said, we have to define the issue. So there's three people who have defined the issue, and they just sent out a letter last week. And those were the first three chief operating officers of the Air Traffic Organization at the FAA. And they sent out a letter to Congress where all three of these individuals who ran the Air Traffic Organization for between the years 2003 and 2013 emphatically said that Congress needs to basically enact legislation that is consistent with what Congressman Schuster and President Trump have proposed, that to spin the Air Traffic Organization off, that they, from their hands-on daily experience, say the system is fundamentally broken and needs structural change. Why are these three COOs wrong to those who oppose this? Jim?
Yeah, I was fortunate to work on Capitol Hill in that time, 2003 to 2013, and I can tell you that I met with those who ran the air traffic operation often, and I don't recall them at the time that they were serving the FAA ever coming to Congress and saying, you need to move the air traffic system out of the FAA. But I think more fundamentally, what you have is the need to build consensus. And I think it was Senator Thune who recently said that, his version of bipartisanship is rural versus urban. And when you rely on a system that goes to user fees, especially for general aviation, that causes a whole nother set of issues. So, we have to look at this thing from everyone's perspective and try to see if we can address those. When you have, there's a trust factor as well. When you have an administration who has proposed to eliminate or significantly reduce the Essential Air Service program for rural America, or you have the Secretary of Transportation suggesting that she wouldn't know what would happen to the contract tower program under a privatized system, people get a little nervous. And so, that's kind of where we are right now, I think. I think we all agree that we can make the system better. I don't think that there's any doubt about that. AOPA has never really defended the status quo. We adamantly opposed user fees. We've been cautious because we don't defend the status quo about our position. And we actually haven't seen any legislation at this point to really make a determination. So that's how I'll answer that question.
Gerald?
So, Will, yeah, one of the consistent things across all of the interest groups is stable funding. I mean, everyone says if we could get stable funding and predictable funding, it would address many of the issues. It would allow for FAA to make capital investments, large capital investments. It would allow FAA to contract for longer periods of time. And so there is that consensus that Jim talked about, but how we get there is still something that has not been sort of worked out, because people have suggested things like a corporation outside of the government or within the government sort of that had their own funding guaranteed and walled off and things like that. So again, you know, deciding what the problem is and then moving to address that problem allows for a lot of different options. And I don't think there's any sort of single answer that we're going to agree on at this point in time, but it's something to look to in terms of what are the options out there to address the problem.
But Dr. Dillingham, if I could comment on that, you raise a very important point about stable funding. And that is, I think at least implicitly, perhaps explicitly, what you're saying. In the current system, you can't do long-term capital planning that you know will have stable, predictable funding. And by the way, we don't need to speculate about, in the current system, what might happen to the contract tower program, because you all recall what happened when we went through sequestration in 2013. What happened to the contract tower program, Paul?
The FAA looked at closing 230-ish air traffic control towers, most in rural America, and most were in the contract tower program.
So we've got a system where we have long-term capital programs, and we have, at best, this is a perfect world that we often don't achieve, an annual appropriations process. And no federal agency, I believe, correct Dr. Dillingham, in U.S. history, has been allowed to go to the bond markets on its own. The U.S. Treasury is the exclusive agent of the U.S. government to go to the bond markets. The FAA cannot go to the bond markets. When I got to DOT, initially as general counsel briefly and then deputy secretary in the early 80s, one of the most astonishing things I learned was that what is now Reagan National and Dulles were a department of the FAA. And unlike virtually every other major airport in America, they couldn't go to the bond markets. And it took us 2.5 years, but we convinced Congress that primarily for that reason, they should be spun off to a newly created regional authority. And I tell you with moral certainty that several hundred yards from here, Reagan National today would look like Terminal A, which was all the terminal there was in the mid-'80s, if we had not accomplished that. And the same kinds of things can be said about Dulles. So if we want to know what the reason is, then we need to go ahead and confront the other issues, and there are real issues about reform, and work them out and get on with this. I just say, think about those two airports. Think about the fact that you can't do long-term predictable capital planning if you can't do long-term predictable capital financing.
And a perfect example of the FAA in that is since 1998, we have been working collaboratively, not collaboratively, and working with them to take the two large facilities on Long Island, combine them up to one, streamline the airspace, make it more efficient. And that program has started and stopped at least 4 times. Each COO promised to get it done, especially the 3 that you just mentioned on that letter. And they were not able to get it done because of funding. Every time we put bids out for the land, we received the land, we worked on airspace, and then all of a sudden it stops because of funding. And that continues to go down. And we still need new buildings. 20 of our en route centers are over 50 years old. And New York TRACON needs to be replaced. And our staffing problem there really, ties into the location. We need to possibly move it further out onto Long Island so we can recruit and retract and retain, air traffic controllers out there. So the funding is the problem. And you look at the Aviation Trust Fund, it's bringing in $14 billion a year. That's why you don't want to shrink aviation in this country, because then it will bring in less than $14 billion a year. And right now, $5 or $6 billion uncommitted in the Aviation Trust Fund. There's money to fund this system. We just got to figure out a way to do it, long-term borrowing, and start modernizing quickly. Now, I am not suggesting, sitting up here in this chair saying, give the FAA a blank check. I would never, ever say that. What I'm saying is, along with finding a funding stream, you also have to find some type of reform to go there also. And there are many ways to get there.
So there's a wrinkle. Everybody keeps talking about long-term funding in the private sector. The wrinkle is that if the private sector may have to pay a higher interest on that long-term funding than the government, in terms of the government, the faith and credit of the government may engender lower interest rates if it were somehow under that umbrella as such. So there's a wrinkle to that long-term funding as well, but still, the need is clearly a consensus around the table.
I think, Nick, would the air carriers be willing to accept a slightly higher interest rate for long-term funding in order to get genuine reform, or do you think it needs to be under a government umbrella?
We don't think it needs to be under a government umbrella, and it wouldn't be up to the airlines, it would be up to the board of the new corporation, which if you look at the structure, you really need to focus on what the structure of that board would look like either under the president's proposal or under Chairman Schuster's proposal, because it's not what it's made out to be. It's a very effective tagline saying it's a giveaway to airlines, but general aviation had 4 seats in Schuster's bill last year. Commercial airlines had 4 seats last year. In the president's proposal, it's 1 and 1. So, that's an important point because the new corporation would have to decide that. We believe the business case can be made because there would be fees coming in to support the system. The other thing I'd like to make clear, Will, is from the very beginning of this debate, congressional testimony, speeches, op-eds, we have said, keep general aviation whole. We do not want that debate. These guys are good, and they're part of the lifeblood of the aviation system. Take them out of the equation, let them keep paying what they're paying now. Because we think we'll get a better system out of it and more efficiencies that in the end will mean lower costs and more pleasurable travel. And we are still in that position and still advocating for that.
So let me turn to, speaking of general aviation, to the guy who everybody loves, who nobody wants to tax, who everybody wants to give a board seat to. That's Mr. Kuhn. But you said something which struck me, and I just like the other panelists to comment on this. Jim said that basically you can't really get anything done in a major transformational way without consensus. And the question is that a red herring, or is that actually true? Look, I'm old enough, unfortunately. I was on Capitol Hill for airline deregulation back in the 70s. There was no consensus on airline deregulation. There was a consensus of a majority of the members of Congress and the administration, but it was vehemently fought, and yet it happened. And you can think of any number of things. Think of the healthcare issue today. There's no consensus on that, other than a majority either has imposed or is proposing to eliminate the healthcare system. But consensus can be sort of an excuse for doing nothing. So do we need consensus, or do we simply need a majority to agree on a path forward? Anybody want to comment on that?
Transportation in this country today would be fundamentally different if we had insisted on a consensus, not just on airline deregulation, but in that same ancient era that you speak of, Will, with such fond memories because you were front and center, trucking deregulation, railroad deregulation. There would be no Amazon today if we had not deregulated trucking, first and foremost, and secondarily air cargo. And the U.S. economy would be smaller and far less efficient if we had not gone through that. Major economic interest in the trucking industry fought tooth and nail against trucking deregulation. Major airlines opposed airline deregulation. The railroad deregulation was a little easier because about 25% of the trackage in America in the 1970s was in bankruptcy court. So there was a little bit more, it wasn't a consensus, but there was a little bit more of an understanding that regulation wasn't working. So I do respectfully disagree with Jim Kuhn that we have to wait for consensus. That is, in fact, not the way we have dealt with these big, tough, controversial issues. You make your case on the merits, you convince the majority of members of Congress, and you get it done. It's not easy, but if you wait for consensus, you don't get anything done.
Okay, let's try and get, and I want to go to the audience here real quickly, but let's try and see if we have consensus on one issue up here. Let's go back to the safety issue because that was raised. And the fundamental question is, would safety be jeopardized, held neutral, or improved by separating the air traffic organization from the FAA and creating two separate entities. And we'll start on that end. Paul, would safety be jeopardized if these reforms took place, or?
It depends on the
impact?
reform itself, and it depends on what the structure looks like. But if it was something like the AIR Act of Chairman Schuster of last year, history will tell you as you look at the other civilized countries that pulled out their operation away from the regulatory and safety function, that safety remained the same or it was enhanced. But it depends on the structure you go to.
Gerald?
Right, that's similar to our findings, that safety either remained the same or was enhanced. Paul used to say, early on in this debate about the concern about a for-profit kind of organization, that most in the United States would not support that kind of thing because the concern that the bottom line may take over as opposed to safety. But up to now, all across the world, safety has not been compromised at all.
Jim Coon?
Well, again, I concur, that it all depends on what the reform looks like. Some argue that it could impede safety. Even though you have a not-for-profit entity, you don't want to lose money, right? So you have to gain efficiencies within the system, and where you make those efficiencies could be a concern. But again, I think it's what the proposal looks like to make a fair determination.
Nick?
I think you have to look at the record of other countries, and others have spoken to that. I had a slightly different point to that because someone said earlier our on-time performance is better. And there's an implication here, a ramification here, which is, yeah, on-time performance is better. That's why 20 years ago, your flight to New York was scheduled for 55 minutes. Today it's scheduled for 80 minutes. That flight time, that block time is growing so we can say that we are on time because we have to be, and we know what the system is going to be able to calculate. Safety, there isn't anybody in aviation who I believe would advocate for anything they thought was going to compromise safety in any way. Otherwise, it's a red herring. And what's going to happen is we will keep the system safe by slowing down the number of flights. That has implications for general aviation, for business aviation, and commercial aviation, as well as cargo. And it's something we need to think about, which is why action is required, rather than just saying, yeah, everything's going to somehow it's going to get better, and that Congress can oversee a 24/7 high-tech business in the way they should to make sure that changes are made quickly.
Jim?
When it comes to safety, the United States is an outlier both as to aviation as compared to other modes of transportation, and we're an outlier as compared, as Paul alluded to the rest of the Western world. 60 countries in the last 25 years have separated from their executive branches the air traffic control operation because they've recognized it as a business, and it's not a government grant program. You have to structure it and run it differently. ICAO in the early 2000s established a principle that it's a fundamental conflict of interest when it comes to safety to have an organization regulate itself, which is what we have today. The FAA writes the rules and enforces the rules for air traffic control on itself. No other safety arm of DOT operates and then regulates itself. It doesn't own railroads, it doesn't own automobile manufacturers, it doesn't own maritime lines. This model is the outlier, and it's contrary to international safety principles. So the bottom line for me is, I think we can count on the fact safety will not deteriorate. As Paul alluded to, it hasn't in the other countries that have taken this step. And I would be optimistic that over time, the safety margin would be enhanced.
Okay, last word on safety, Ed.
Well, I looked at those studies, at least the way I understood them is that they remained constant or they may have improved a little bit. In no case did the safety of any of those countries reach the level that we have in the United States. The United States has the largest, safest, most complex, most diverse, most efficient air transportation system in the world. And I think that baseline needs to be understood and established.
Okay, thank you. Andy, do we have questions?
So there's a question related to, and I guess it would be for those that would want to spin off looking at what the criteria would be for the CEO, the leadership management of the nonprofit, what kind of, really, but focusing in on what kind of criteria and leadership you'd have.
So, does somebody want to address that?
Well, safeguards put in place because there are two different ways to go about it. The administration's proposing one, Chairman Schuster proposed another one, where different stakeholders in the system would be allowed to nominate X number of people for a position, none of whom could work for the industry or have worked or have any kind of financial relationship. Their fiduciary duty would be to the corporation and to the traveling and the shipping public. So basically, the devil's always in the details, but there is information on that, and it is not in any way, or shape, or form going to be, these are going to be independent directors who have hopefully some knowledge about the industry because, you know, unlike Chairman Ranking Member DeFazio, we think having some experience in what you're doing is probably good for running the operation. So.
Any other comment?
Yeah, you know, we'll have to wait and see. I guess what we saw with the ATO was the first several came directly from the airlines, who were airline operations people. Certainly in NAV Canada, there we had someone from the airlines that was involved. I think it's important, you know, as we look at what we want leadership to be, that we keep in mind that it's a broad aviation system. It's not an airline system. It's an aviation system, and we'd need it to work for everybody.
Yeah, so you had also kind of a couple of questions related to the assets, transferring of assets, and then kind of juxtaposition was what about as an alternative to taking it off budget? So you still keep it in the government. So it's kind of, you know, those two kind of go off in a little different directions.
Okay, so should if there's a new organization, should they have to pay for the assets? Are they really assets? I think the president suggested they were liabilities. And then the other question is, what is the reality of being able to use the existing system but take it off budget? So somebody want to address those?
You want to take it off budget. You just got to say that is a fantasy that will go unfulfilled. There's a reason that the opposition in Congress, one of the pockets of opposition, are the Appropriation Committee staffers. They have no intention of giving up control of this flow of funds. And they will never agree to a consensus on this, to put it mildly, and they are overt and public in saying so. And so that is not a real option. And I think, you know, the reality is sequestration, shutdowns, controllers going to work without being paid for up to 3 weeks at a time has happened in a shutdown not very many years ago.
2013.
It's not some ephemeral notion that we're going to go off budget. It ain't going to happen. So I think you can lay that one to one side as any kind of even remotely realistic alternative.
Just to note, when Jim Burnley says it's unfulfilled fantasy, nobody knows better because he has more fantasies that are unfulfilled than anybody else. Anyway.
Well, one of mine is being like Jim, being able to look over anybody and see what's in front of me. In terms of the assets, well, they've been paid for. Aviation stakeholders, particularly the traveling public, has already paid and continues to pay for those assets every single day.
It's not clear to me from a scoring standpoint. I think they talk about this transition proposal would cost somewhere between $20 to $46 billion over the next 10 years. And I think, obviously, at a time when budgets are tight, $46 billion over 10 years, $4.6 billion a year, is significant. But I think what that misses also is the reality that every country where this has been tried, and some of them are tiny, some of them are very tiny. It's taken at least 5 years, in some cases 7. There are delays that are inherent in that cost. So even if you go beyond You know, whether it's $20 billion over 10 years or $46 billion over 10 years, it's probably 5 to 7 years in the best case scenario. And I don't think those costs get calculated.
Maybe a quick, I hope you'll be quick if you have another comment on this, because I think we
I don't.
have one more. Okay, because Andy's actually, he's really not getting these, he's just making them up, but that's all right, go ahead. If the question is this the best looking panel you've had in the entire conference, the answer is, we have consensus on that.
Is this the best moderator that we've ever had? Was actually my question,
right.
Will.
Go ahead.
Now, the one issue that I think has come up, I've heard in a couple different, just, you know, outside conversations. How does one, if you were going to go down the route, how do you actually execute it? How do you make the transition happen? And that may be your
Great
final.
question. Anybody want to address that?
Well, I've actually had some hands-on experience with that. I said earlier that the Federal Railroad Administration doesn't run a railroad, but that has not historically always been the case. In fact, in the 1980s, again, when I showed up at DOT, it owned 2 railroads. The Alaska Railroad, which was created when Alaska was still a territory around the beginning of the 20th century, and Conrail, which had been created out of the bankrupt railroads in the Northeast. And we sold the Alaska Railroad, a straightforward transaction to the state of Alaska, but Conrail was much more complicated. Conrail was a very big, complex, 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week operation, transportation operation. And we went through quite a spirited debate. We never got to consensus, but we came out with legislation that let us do an IPO. And when we did the IPO, it was just amazing what happened. The day that we sold those shares, Conrail operated exactly the same way it operated the day before we sold those shares. And that's what would happen in this transformation. Now, Ed, you had some numbers you didn't source, up to $46 billion. I don't know where those come from, but yes, it will be over time a process. And when you're talking about moving all of Paul's members plus some others off the federal payroll to another entity, that's complicated all by itself. But the fact that it's complicated is no argument against doing it if it needs to be done for the sake of the country and most of all for the sake of everybody who flies. So whether it takes 3 years or 4 years, the fact is it can be done. Everybody involved will know it's complicated. They will go at it as best they can in a deliberate way. But again, you know, stuff just keeps getting thrown up against the wall. It's too hard. We can't get there. It costs too much. Well, what I know is too hard and costs too much and doesn't get the outcomes we need is the status quo.
Anybody else, real quickly, because the hook is right here. I would just say, you know, Doug Parker at American Airlines once said the single worst argument for not doing this is that it's hard. I mean, my God, what kind of a country do we have that we're not going to tackle hard things? So that's an interesting point. Okay, I'm sorry, we've run over, and my parking meter is about to expire. So thank you very much for being so attentive. I wish we could do this a lot longer. And thank the panel for, you know, not tearing each other's eyes out. You were all very civilized and appreciate it.